So I'm Bree Allard, and I am a ninth grade English teacher at Levitt Area High School in Turner. And presenting with me today is Michelle DuBois, who is an eighth grade literacy teacher at Lewiston Middle School in Lewiston, Maine. And again, as we said, make sure your screens are turned off and you are muted. And make sure you have something to write with today as well. Some note paper for catching some really cool ideas. We had emailed out some handouts if you wanted to print those ahead of time, but we will put links to those handouts in the chat when we break out into our breakout rooms, and your Grading for Equity book as well. There'll be some times that we will want you to maybe find something in the book to highlight that we found very useful, that we hope that you would find useful as well. And again, please use the chat box for any comments or questions during our presentation today. Here we go. The first thing we want to start with is we want to take a poll as we start diving into chapter 7, which is about accuracy. We want to see how accurately do your grades represent your students' work. So please respond on this poll: highly accurately, accurately, somewhat accurately, or not accurately. Give you a few minutes to take the poll. And it looks like we have just about everyone in. And we'll go ahead and stop the poll there. Thank you so much. Here are the results. With 56% at somewhat accurately, and 33% accurately, and 7% highly accurately. We will come back to that sort of question again at the end. We won't do another poll, but keep your response that you answered for this in the back of your mind as we continue on with the discussion through the chapter and kind of thinking on our own how accurately we really are, and if this changes by the end of today's discussion. So today we will discuss the following points from chapter 7: avoiding zeros, minimum grading, and a 0 to 4 scale. This is kind of like a menu that we want to share with you from the book. So as we go over each of these things, please keep in mind that Feldman isn't suggesting that you incorporate all of these practices into your instruction all at once, that you can pick and choose what fits best for you, for your school, for your students, and then work up to some of these others later on. So we're going to share with you a little bit about all three of them, but in no way feel pressured that you have to begin thinking today on how you can apply all of these into your classroom immediately. So let's start at the pillars driving principle and put that in our main focus. So the accuracy driving principle is that our grading must use calculations that are mathematically sound, easy to understand, and correctly describe a student's level of academic performance. That may feel like a lot to take in all at once, but he does break it down within the chapter and in chapter 8 as well. So we'll take it piece by piece. So where do we begin to make our grades more accurate? First, we have to see what the problem is with our grades and see how inaccurate they are. Before I got into reading this book over this past summer, I fell under this curse, if you will, of assuming that when I entered grades into my grading program, these little math fairies somewhere behind the computer program and the grading software magically calculated the average grade. And so this automatically meant that my grades were fair and accurate, right? I felt that I could say to a student or a parent, if they ever asked about a grade, that's just how the math worked out when I entered the grades. And I didn't really feel like I had to take much ownership. So it kind of took the fault away from me and as the teacher, and allowed the grading to be done by this grading program. That, of course, is the wrong mindset. And that's, I feel like, where the problem was, for me, where I needed to begin. So as we work through the chapter today, I encourage you as well to examine how your established methods of calculating grades create those inaccuracies and those misleading descriptions of student performance, and how to improve the accuracy of our grades. As Feldman quotes in the chapter, we need to trust our minds and not just our machines. The first strategy he suggests trying out is to avoid giving zeros for missing work. In the reading, he mentions this idea of catching fish and averaging the weight of the fish caught. I like to take that analogy a step further though, and this is how I like to explain it when I'm sharing it with other teachers and administrators. And so I use this example and I say, here you see two students. Let's say you taught both of them how to fish. After a few lessons, you sent them out to prove to you that they know how to fish. Student A has caught a fish. Clearly, the student has learned from your lesson and has been successful in catching a fish. Student B, you'll notice, has an empty net. Does the empty net mean that student B did not learn anything from your lessons? Should student B be given a 0 for this assignment? I would say no. Ask any fisherman and they will tell you that there are some days that the fish just don't bite. Likewise, in reality, if a student hasn't handed in an assignment to you and the work is missing, you haven't caught anything from that student. So how can you average into that student's grade whether or not they have the knowledge from the lesson you taught them if you haven't caught anything from them yet? As Feldman states in his book, not having evidence of what a student knows isn't the same as having evidence that she knows nothing. And that really struck a chord with me and has been one of my goals this year, is to really implement not giving students zeros for missing work, because the 0 oftentimes equates to a student or to parents that they know nothing. And I don't believe that that's true for most of my students, that they don't know nothing, they don't know anything. We just haven't caught that knowledge yet. And so sometimes we have to give them a little bit more time to show us what they do know. So here's an example that is found in the book. So if you read the chapter, you've already seen this, but I do want to highlight it today to show how zeros have, how a 0 impacts grades and how they have a high negative impact on the average of grades. In this chart that Feldman includes on page 83, if you wanted to see it for yourself in the book, he shows how even just 1 0 in a series of grades affects the overall average. To keep it simple, he did make all the grades the same for all the other assignments at 85%. But even if the grades were different, you would still be able to see how a 0 for a missing assignment greatly affects the students, and it would be like the same effect. As you can see from this data, just 1 0 for a missing assignment took a B average student and dropped them to a D average in this particular district. I know that in some districts, even that I've worked in, a 68% is actually failing. So in that case, that student's grade would drop from a B average all the way to failing, simply because of having 1 missing assignment that is marked with a 0. So how can we change this? How can we not see this negative impact on students' grades for missing assignments? And Feldman suggests marking it in some other way that your grading program allows you to mark it. So mark it as missing, mark it as incomplete, mark it red if it's a color code. Each grading program in each district and school district may have a different way that you could mark the grades instead of just putting a 0 in. And then that same message is still sent to students and parents that they're great, that this assignment is missing and still needs to be completed, and that the grades are not going to be negatively affected just yet until that assignment has been turned in, and then the students' performance can be more accurately assessed. The second thing that Feldman suggests in this chapter is minimum grading. And if your district uses a 0 to 100 grading scale, this is something that you could do. If your school already is using a 0 to 4 grading scale, you might have to kind of work a little bit more around how Feldman talks about it in this chapter to apply this to your classroom if you want to use this as something to work on. But primarily for districts that use the 0 to 100 grading, he's focusing on those districts. And he argues that the 0 in those types of grading systems has an even greater negative effect when you're putting it into that scale. And so he proposes setting a minimum grading scale, and he states here on page 84, if you want to highlight it, we can correct the 100-point scale's disproportionality toward failure by instituting a minimum grade. And that means setting a percentage that no student can score below. So instead of having a 0 as the lowest score, he suggests a 50 as the lowest score. And again, you would work this into your own grading system according to what is your lowest score for an F. And his examples in the book, he uses districts where 60 is like the lowest grade before failing. A 59 would be failing. Again, if you're in a school system where 70 is passing and a 69 is failing, then you would make maybe 60 as your lowest grade, your minimum grade. But why? Why do this? What's the benefit with this? So it makes the gradations of the letter scales more proportionate. Again, if 60 is the passing for your district, then the 50 is only 10 below and is probably more proportionate to the other letter grades in the passing range as well. So a 70 would be a D and an 80 would be a C. And so it would be 10 points separating between the different letter grades. So why isn't the F range also 10 points instead of 0 to 60 being the F range? So they have 60 points for failing, but only 10 points to go from a C to a D. I hope that sort of is making sense to everyone. Because if they have a 0, it makes the climb a lot harder to go up to get to the passing than if they were only 10 points away. Just like if they go from a 60 to a 70 and move up from a D to an C, they only have to work within those 10 points. And so likewise, if we want to see less students failing, we should help it make it easier for them to be able to get out from a 0 failing to the passing grades. I know that this can be really hard for a lot of teachers to swallow. I think that in our society, we are still looking at zeros as ways to show parents and show students and send them these messages that they didn't get work done. So I leave you with this quote that's found on the top of page 87. And again, I would strongly encourage you to highlight this in your books because I keep coming back to this quote myself personally, and I don't feel like there's really any other way to reword it. So I just want to share it with you. And Feldman, to put it in perspective, Feldman is quoting a study that is done by the University of Massachusetts, where they followed the grading practices of an urban high school for 7 years. And they had this, teachers during that study were kind of discouraged and giving this common complaint. And I feel like this is a common complaint of teachers even still today, where they get about not giving the zeros and instead of a 50, instead feeling like it diminishes their authority. And yeah, trying to get, again, to like send that message to parents and students and diluting sort of like their grading policies and where they really need to, like, this is where the buck stops. And so this is what the researchers had to say to the teachers then. And what I present to you as well is like, just like this big golden nugget. So I said minimum grading actually empowers teachers in schools rather than disempowers them, as it lessens, dampens out, and neutralizes most of the negative aspects of grades and grading, while still creating a climate of caring, hope, and support, particularly for those students whose growth and development will most probably always be an intermittent and chaotic process and path. Minimum grading still can increase student motivation. Even though they have a 50, it's still an F. There's no such thing as an F plus or an F minus. A 50 is still failing, if that's where it would be for you in your school department. So it still can send that sort of message that you're not doing well, you need to pass in work, you need support. And that's the thing that we need to really stress, is that our grading should continue to empower the teachers to support their students, to see where they are struggling, where they need help, but in a climate of this caring, hope, and support. So we're going to pause here. I know that was like a lot of information to take in, 2 out of the 3 bullet points that we're planning to discuss today. So I want to give you time to discuss these. So we're going to pause and separate you all into breakout rooms. Today, when we go into the breakout rooms, we would like you to organize yourselves to have a timekeeper. We are going to do the breakout rooms for 10 minutes. So based on the number, and I think we're splitting the rooms up into about 4 or 5 people, depending on how many participants we have today. And so please pay attention to the time. And so please have someone designated as the timekeeper to really keep their eye on the clock for those 10 minutes. Also assign a discussion facilitator. That person we would like to see, make sure that everyone has a chance to talk and share their thoughts. And then a note keeper. When we come back from the breakout room, I am going to call in a couple different groups to share out what you talked about in the group. So please have someone who will be that person who will share out. In the breakout room today, we are going to have you do this activity, the circle, square, triangle, and we are, I believe, putting in the link to this template for you to be able to actually put your own information in. But of course, if you don't want to write on the template on the computer, the digital copy, you can simply put a circle and a square and a triangle on a scrap piece of paper and answer these thoughts as you are discussing. So the circle stands for a question going around in my mind. The square stands for something I learned that's squared with my beliefs. And the triangle is 3 important points to remember. And I hope that you would find these would be good activities you might use in your own classroom too. So at this time, we are going to give you 10 minutes to discuss, and then we'll come back together as a group to share out afterwards. Thank you. Welcome back. Hopefully you all had a really good discussion about those first 2 bullet points, avoiding zeros and minimum grading. At this time, I'm going to randomly call on groups to share out. You can either speak personally if you feel comfortable doing that, or you could summarize what your group discussed with the circle, the square, and the triangle. So if I could have someone who was from group number 2, unmute yourself and you can introduce yourself and go ahead.
I was the note taker. I didn't know my group number. Sorry.
That's okay. That's okay.
Okay. How much time?
You can, just a minute or so is fine.
Okay. So some of the questions going around our minds is, how do I help colleagues, parents, higher ed, administration that maybe have fears about us making some major changes to grades, like not doing the minimum grading or not counting zeros, and how do we make that go forward while also listening to their fears too? And why do we have to give grades at all? And something that's squared with our beliefs that zeros can be demotivating because it can give them a hole they can't dig themselves out of, and that education is not for sorting. 3 important points to remember is that grades are measurements, not judgments, and kids are worth far more than a grade, and that grades can sometimes make you worthy of something or not worthy of something, like get into an honors class or not an AP class. And maybe that's not the message we want to send, and that it's really about relationships that help them do the work and learn the material.
Thank you. Those are very important. Before I give any sort of feedback and sort of respond to some of those things, I want to hear from another group, because I think that maybe we'll start to see some similar questions or important points. And so the note taker from group number 5.
That would be me. My name's Kaylee Warner. So we had a conversation, not many questions, but a member did bring up, how do we adjust this grading practice while existing in a system that has its own assumptions about grading and students? Something we talked about a squared belief is that the math doesn't always add up and reflect the true nature of a student's knowledge or capability. And the 3 points we kind of concluded on were that negative impact usually happens in grading for disadvantaged students or students that experience trauma. So that's something to critically remember. A 0 doesn't always include the incentive. It doesn't always do what our intentions are meant for.
Yeah.
And the 1, it still shows, if we provide students with a 1 on a 1 to 1 to 4 scale, or 0 to 4, the 1 still shows that you get exposure to the content. It's still showing that the student was there and they were present, and it shows more than it would with a 0.
Awesome. Thank you, Kaylee. And we are going to talk more about the 0 to 4 scale in the next segment here that Michelle will be talking about. And that will definitely be coming up about how the 0 versus a 1 could be used in the grading for that. One thing I wanted to come back around to was one question that said, how do you really like put that 0, like not put a 0 in when you're sort of trying to explain this to other teachers and other, like to the parents and students. And one thing I want to say for me personally, like I said, this is my goal that I've been working on this school year. And so trying to talk to administrators or other coworkers about doing this and explaining it to students and parents is, it's not that I'm never going to put a 0 in. There may come a time when, you know, for me, my semester is ending next week. And if I still have, and then I won't see these students again. I get new students starting on, you know, January 25th or something. So eventually the 0 would have to go in for anything that's still outstanding and missing. It's more for when you're looking at the beginning part of a quarter and the beginning of a semester when you're just starting to meet students, and as you're going along, that you may not put those 0s in right away for missing work. So I know there are some teachers who are still like, but I have to put a 0 in. Well, it could come eventually. I also was actually just having a conversation with a coworker today who said that and I've been talking to her, trying to like get her to sort of buy into this as well. And she was saying, okay, so I just want to be open with you, let you know that I put some 0s in today, and like, don't feel bad about it. And she said, but I did email the student and their guidance counselor and a parent and say, I'm still going to accept the work, but just, you know, our semester is ending in like 4 or 5 days. And so we really do need them to see that this is what your grade's going to be if you don't get this in. And so it does come to a point as well where she was still having a conversation with the students, the parents, the guidance counselors. She's still working with that student to allow them to submit the work late, and understanding and being very clear and open with her discussion with the student and parents that that 0 is not permanent. That 0 can be taken out and a new grade could replace it. That it's not final, but if you get something so early on in the school year, like we were several of you brought out in your points to remember that how demotivating that 0 could be, especially in the beginning of a quarter, beginning of a semester, depending on how your school system might be even working this year, and all the pandemic that's going on too, like all the other factors that you play into what's going on in students' education right now, how demotivating a 0 could be right out of the gate just for missing work. But that it could have to go in later on done when you're at the end of a year? What are you going to do with all those, if you have students who have missing assignments and you've done your due diligence to chase after them, to email home, to try to get them to stay after or come see you in a study hall, and they still don't have it in, eventually that has to go in. I don't believe that Joe Feldman is saying never, ever, ever. So that hopefully that sort of helps answer some of those questions that some of you might have still circling around in your mind. But at this point, I am going to pass the mic on to my co-leader, Michelle. And again, she's going to be talking to you about the last strategy from chapter 7 on making our grades more mathematically accurate by replacing the 0 to 100 scale, if that applies to you in your district, with the 0 to 4 scale. And it's not necessarily saying on the whole district level, but how can you do this even in your own classroom? So take it away, Michelle.
Thank you. Can you switch the slide, Bree? Thanks. So I'm kind of here, and I know that it depends on what school you're in, whether you're using a 100-point scale or a 0 to 4 scale, but just thinking about these different scales in the real world outside of the classroom, the 100-point scale is not readily used. So if you think about when you took your praxis test or when you took your driver's test, everyone I got the same license that everyone else got. I didn't have on my license that this was my second or third time or fifth time doing it. So I think it's kind of important that outside of the classroom, we don't readily use the 100-point scale. And there are other alternatives like the 0 to 4 scale, but please be careful when we think, oh, it'll be great if we just go to a 0 to 4 scale. What actually do the numbers represent, and what scale are you going to create? In my district, they gave us the scale. I didn't have any kind of option to do a certain kind of scale, but think about, and in Lewiston, we are not allowed to add any zeros to any of our grades. So the lowest grade for us is a 1 and on our scale. I want to kind of give you a little bit of an example. My daughter goes to USM, and she is trying to get into the OT program, and she was taking a biology class, and we got quarantined because of someone that we knew had tested positive. And so she had to hand in an assignment where she did a drawing, and she did it on lined paper. And the teacher emailed back saying, she took 5 points off for it being on lined paper. Well, just so that it happens the way the math kind of figured out is that she ended up with a C- for the class. And in order to be in her major, she needed to get a C. So that 5 points is costing her $1,000 maybe to retake a class for not having used certain kind of paper. So sometimes the way the math just kind of works out when you start, fiddling like, I'm going to take this point and this point, really what's the difference between an 87 and an 88? Like, how can you accurately say this student's an 88 and this student's an 87? Sometimes it's better to go to kind of a 0-4 scale. So it kind of sometimes it creates the same type of problem, but it minimizes it at least between like where those areas are. So I just want you to keep in mind that be careful what kind of scale you create. Some people kind of go like, okay, a 1's a 25, a 2's a 50, so a 3's a 75, and a 4's a A. So that in our school you have to get, and then when you convert it, like some schools convert like this 3 to an actual and bring it back to the 100-point scale. I don't know why they do that, to determine like honor roll and things like that nature. So they could say, well, if you got all B's, you're not making honor roll. You have to get all A's to get honor roll or whatever. So sometimes that creates some problems. and where is your actual failing? Like, you know, if your C is a 50, you know, so your 2 is a 50, then you wouldn't be passing. So you have to be careful. Usually these scales are given to us, and just, you know, make sure that you're really cognizant of the scales that you're given. I always want to remind teachers too to take a look at your grades. Like, once you've entered all your grades, go back over them and kind of look at them in perspective for each kid. I've had sometimes in the past when we haven't used a 0 to 4 scale that, you know, the kid has like an 89 and they need a 90 to make honor roll. It's just that 1 point, and, you know, it's like, what's a 1 point? Like, really? So personally, I believe that, you know, grades should contribute to student confidence. They shouldn't raise anxiety. And so this is kind of what I've given to my parents. Bree, if you can change the slide. This is sort of what I've sent to parents to try and do that marketing piece I know a lot of you mentioned. And I really try and focus on the learning, since we are standard-based in Lewiston, to tell kids that it should be a reflection of where they are in their learning, right? And what kind of happens in Lewiston in the middle school is our literacy standards are year-long. So we have parents right off the gate in September, October, emailing me upset that their child isn't getting 4s because they've always been a 4 student. So this kind of helps to show everyone that, you know, if your child is receiving 4s right off the gate, then I'm probably boring them and they probably already knew it. So I do a lot of, and this gets into all the other things that have to do with grading. You know, what are you grading? What are you grading? Just summatives? Are you grading homework or formatives? And that's another conversation to have. But this kind of bringing it back to the learning, and it's a progression and it's a continuum, is really important, I think, for kids in their learning. So what we're going to do is go into the breakout room, and please assign, again, a timekeeper, a discussion facilitator, and a note keeper to talk about, and if you go to the next slide, we're going to talk about in our breakout room, what does the text say about the 0 to 4 scale, and what do you think about it? Do you think this is a good compromise? Do you think this is something that you would want to move to if you aren't doing standard-based, or if you are doing the 0 to 100 scale and not doing standards? Is this really going to solve the problem of what you're having? So you have about 10 minutes. There is a reflection journal that you can use, and you can also use this in your classroom. I've started using it in mine. It's from Kylene Beers and Robert Prope's new book that just came out, Forged by Reading. So if you haven't read it, I highly suggest it. And it's about, what does the text say? What do you think about this? And then you're going to focus on, what did your partners think and what do you think now? So has your thinking changed being in this breakout session? Okay, so we're just going to take a couple moments to share out some of the pieces on the reflection journal. So I'm going to pick group number 3.
All right, that was me, sorry. So I explained a little bit about what the 0 to 4 looks like because my other 3 counterparts hadn't really experienced that, or some had for a few years and didn't see how it could work so well. But we also initially talked about how parents don't understand it. They don't want to deal with battling with parents to try to help them understand it, and students that it's harder. There are, I think all of my notes that I had typed in here went away. So So we had a discussion about it, and I explained more about, it is a huge marketing problem, how you can use it to really show what a student knows versus a numerical thing. The formatives are there to help show which parts of the standard they may not understand, and then you can break it down and say, okay, you did really well on these two in the summative, but this one concept, you're not quite there yet. So parents can look at that and see how it is, and then I personally feel that it's a better system for the 1 to 4 because you have to be more careful with how you grade and more thoughtful about creating lessons to actually capture what you have been teaching and what you want to capture for what they should know.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's kind of confusing with the scale because you don't have to do standards-based grading to do the 0 to 4 scale. It matches really well with standards-based grading. So that's where it's mostly used, and it is a huge marketing problem because parents are like, I don't understand what this 3 is, and they don't understand, especially like the kids at our school, why their grades aren't like changing, because like you're getting graded on a certain standard and that standard goes up, but your other standards are not being graded and they don't understand that. So yeah, it's a big learning curve for a lot of parents, but really what it does is it changes the discrepancy between the letter grades and makes it more uniform, so that when a student is trying to move from, say, a 1 to a 2, it's the same distance as moving from a 2 to a 3 and a 3 to a 4 versus a 0 to 100 scale, which is very disproportionate. Okay, can I have group number 6?
Yeah, so we talked, we went back and forth about the pros and cons, but most of us agreed that at the end of the day, it seems like 0 to 4 it holds more value. It's easier to show what they do know versus, what they didn't do. There were cons though, because it's harder for parents to understand. We did really like the table that was shown where it really reflects, okay, this is what your child's doing. And then we also talked about how we've felt like there was trouble with doing this if it didn't match with what our district was doing. So we kind of bounced off ideas on how we could still make it work, even if that's not what our district was doing.
I had that initial problem too when I worked at other districts that didn't have a 0 to 4 scale, and I would just take the chunks of my grades and just convert them to like whatever this was ended up being a 3, and I just did it that way. And that I used to just stress out so bad when I was 0 to 100, because I was just really stressing, like when you mathematically added something up and you're like, oh my gosh, this kid's like an 88 or 80, or like just these little 1-pointer things just drove me crazy. I'm like, I just want to give feedback to my kids and have it be relevant for them so that they can grow and learn. And so I felt the 0 to 100 scale really super stressful. I think what we need to look at this is kind of a continuum. Like these are choices that if you're way on this side where you're very, very traditional about grading and your school district is very, very traditional, how can you start to move along the continuum and to get to that place where grades are there to move your learners along and to give them feedback that they can make a change with. So I think that's what we're all aiming towards, and accuracy kind of plays that. If kids don't feel that their grades are accurate, then they don't trust you. And then that leads into a whole big can of worms that you don't want to get into, because then you start losing them motivationally. So I've seen that with the 100-point scale where there's been a lot of trust issues, and that seems to lessen to the 0 to 4 scale. I've kind of seen in pieces of that. So now we kind of wanted you to take a look at our anticipation guide. We're going to put you in different breakout rooms to meet new people for this little session. I've used anticipation guides before with my kids. It's really interesting how you look at like one quote and what you think and how you interpret that quote. And then after talking to different people, you see kind of like the different perspectives and shades of gray within that quote. So now we're going to move into the different breakout rooms. Please make sure you have a timekeeper, discussion facilitator, and a note keeper. And if you can switch the slide, Bree, we're going to focus on the first 3 quotes. So what did you think about the first 3 questions, and what do you think now? So you're going to talk to your group about initially, if you filled it out, what you thought before the reading, and then you're going to kind of talk about it. And after you've talked about it with everybody else, what do you really think now? All right. So would anyone like to share out about the first quote? The more math we use to arrive at a grade, the more objective it will be.
Well, I'll share just my thought is that if you're trying to sort students for a valedictorian and a salutatorian, I think it is probably more objective. It's more factual. It's more discriminating. Maybe not factual. Maybe it's not more objective. It's more discriminating.
Thank you for sharing that. And I think we really need to think about, what do we mean by more math? Are you using the mean, the median, the mode? Like how are you determining which, math is the more accurate piece and more objective? Which I really find that interesting. Let's just check in really quick about the second one, which was, instead of prompting greater effort, low grades more often cause students to withdraw from learning. Does anyone have a hot spot that they want to say about that?
Yeah, I would jump in and say like 100% that's true. If you pay attention to data at all and you start tracking where kids are and how they do from year to year and trimester to trimester and class to class, you see the kids who get bad grades, like they're not improving because they got bad grades. So it's one of those things where like, why do you keep doing something that isn't actually helping and actually making it worse? Eventually, if a kid keeps failing everything, they probably stop coming to school, or at least mentally and in their spirit stop coming to school. So
Yeah.
Clearly it's not working. Like, stop doing it.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. This trimester, I gave probably 15 kids like what would be an equivalent of incomplete, and just wiped their slate clean and gave them a restart. And I really had to have a tough conversation with admin, because they were like, why are you doing that? And I'm like, if I don't give them this clean slate, I've lost them for the whole year. And literacy standards are for the whole year. So I can do that because we're going to repeat some of the standards and have opportunity for them. The last one really quick, not having evidence of what a student knows isn't the same as having evidence that a student knows nothing. Does anyone want to pop in on that one?
I do.
Go right ahead.
Absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. It just isn't. We don't know why they don't know it. We don't know why they didn't do it. On the day that I give whatever it is for an assessment, what I know, if a kid does it, is that on that day, in that way, that kid can do it. And if a kid doesn't, what I know is on that day, in that way, that kid didn't do it. I have no idea whether they can or not. I just know that they didn't.
Yeah, and that's eloquently said. Like, we've had where I've had discussions where kids have verbally said stuff, And, you know, if I had just gone with, oh, their reading log or whatever, I would have failed them. But because they didn't do their reading log, but then in the discussion, they come up with these beautiful ideas where they've actually understood something. And so you really have to think, you know, when we take grades, they're snapshots. It's like a camera, a picture, and it's that moment in time. And we need to make sure that we get enough snapshots so we find that moment in time where we can see what they're doing and we see what they know, you know. We are getting up on the time where it's almost time for us to go. So if Bree, if you can click the next slide. So to recap, we gave you 3 things: avoiding zeros, minimum grading, 0 to 4 scale. These are ideas that are like a menu. Pick and choose where you want to start. Some of you might be on the continuum where you're past these, you've already done these, or you found that these things were not strategies that you wanted to utilize or processes that you wanted to try on. And, you know, we're really focused on the mathematical accuracy of our grades. And unfortunately, grading is, it's not just about the math, it has to do with other pieces. And those are other pillars, and we'll be getting to those. But pick and choose where you want to start. And the whole point is we want our grades to represent student learning. And that's where we want to end up. How can they be as accurately depicting what students are learning as possible? So for next time,
And I want to just jump in too and say, so today we only talked about 3 of the bullet points for this accuracy pillar. And next week we will finish off with the last 2. So like Michelle just said, if you were like still sort of struggling with any of these 3 points, maybe one of the next 2 would be something that you could also start with, because we're going to add that to our menu for a total of 5 different things that we can work on with our accuracy, with our grading. So for next week, we want to prepare you before we leave on that anticipation guide, the last 3 questions. If you haven't already answered them, answer them before we come together again next week and read through chapter 8. And again, the next 2 bullet points, the final parts of the pillar, are focusing on recent achievements, grading the most recent work that students pass in, and also discussing the idea of grading the group versus the individual when you're doing group activities in a classroom. So on behalf of Michelle and myself, we thank you all for coming tonight, and we look forward to seeing you all next week, same time, same place.